She was screaming at the top of her lungs in the middle of the street, barefoot, bathrobe flapping in the wind, phone in one hand and HOA clipboard in the other. Karen had just watched her prized luxury SUV get hauled away by a tow truck she didn't recognize, and now she was yelling into her phone like it was the apocalypse. "He stole my car," she shrieked at the dispatcher as if her life depended on it. But the sheriff's deputy on the other end already had the full story. Across the street, leaning against a wooden post with a cowboy hat low over his eyes and a satisfied smirk on his face, stood Jake Walker. One boot resting on a hay bale, a glass of sweet tea in hand. He simply nodded to the tow truck driver as it rolled off with Karen's Mercedes. 2 days ago, she'd towed his truck illegally and laughed in his face. Now, he owned the very company she'd used to do it. And this? This was just chapter 1. It started, as these things always do, with something small and stupid. Jake's old Ford F-350 wasn't flashy, but it got the job done. It had been in the family longer than most of the HOA's residents had lived in the neighborhood. He'd parked it outside his property gate like he always did while unloading cattle feed. He wasn't even there for 15 minutes. But that was 15 minutes too long for Karen, the self-appointed Grand Empress of the HOA. She strutted around the neighborhood like she'd been cast in a low-budget reality show, clipboard always in hand, wearing outfits that screamed suburban power trip. And when she saw Jake's dusty ranch truck parked outside the designated HOA zone, she saw red. Jake had just finished dragging a feed sack into the barn when he noticed the empty patch where his truck had been. At first, he thought one of his farmhands had moved it, maybe to fetch tools. But then he saw the telltale black skid marks on the road and a neon orange tag zip-tied to his gate. It was a towing slip. His name was spelled wrong, the address was off by 2 digits, and there was a smug little note handwritten at the bottom: "Property eyesore removed for community beautification." Jake knew exactly who wrote that. Karen. The only woman in the county who had both a laminated HOA badge and a personalized bullhorn. Jake stormed down the gravel road toward the HOA office, but didn't make it far before Karen intercepted him like a heat-seeking missile. She was wearing a blazer 3 sizes too tight and sunglasses that belonged in a 1980s music video. "You're welcome," she beamed, waving her clipboard like a magic wand. "That thing was a rust bucket. I did the neighborhood a favor." Jake was still in work boots, covered in hay, sweat, and disbelief. He asked her calmly where the truck had been taken. She smirked and said, "I don't know, it's not my problem anymore." It became his problem fast. Without his truck, he couldn't move feed, check on the irrigation system, or get tools to the north pasture. His ranch relied on that truck like blood relies on a heart. The next morning, Jake caught a ride from his cousin into town and made his way to the towing yard. It was called Rusty's Recovery, and judging by the number of half-stripped vehicles piled up like scrap metal Jenga, it lived up to its name. Inside the cracked office trailer, a man with a beard like barbed wire and a name tag that just said Rusty offered him coffee in a chipped mug and looked at the towing order. "Yeah, we got it from the HOA lady yesterday," he grunted. "She called it in and faxed this over." Rusty showed Jake a form that had Karen's signature but absolutely no legal authorization. Jake squinted at it. The property wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. His mailbox was within the boundary, but the land, his land, wasn't. Rusty shrugged. "Look man, I just hook 'em and haul 'em. If it's a bad tow you gotta take it up with her. Fees $900 though." Jake asked if that included lunch and a car wash. Rusty didn't laugh. Back at the ranch, Jake didn't rant. He didn't scream. He sat on his porch with a notebook and wrote down every detail he could remember. The tow company, the driver's name, the times, Karen's note. Then he called a man named Ethan from back in his AG investment days. Ethan owed him a favor. A big one. 3 phone calls later, Jake had an idea so outrageous it made him chuckle out loud. The next day, he drove to the tow yard again, but not to get his truck. He walked straight into Rusty's office and made him an offer. Turns out Rusty had been trying to sell the business for months. Between HOA politics, broken trucks, and insurance nightmares, he was tired. Jake pulled out a checkbook. The purchase went through under the name Walker Transport, LLC. That night, Karen called Rusty's number to brag about towing another car. Jake answered. 2 hours later, Karen had left her Mercedes GLC parked illegally during her HOA meeting in front of the clubhouse, right across a painted red fire lane. Jake rolled up in a company-marked tow truck, papers in hand, and the very same driver she had used just 2 days prior. The tow was clean, legal, and recorded on 3 cameras. Karen came sprinting out in high heels, arms flailing like a malfunctioning windmill. "That's my car," she shrieked. Jake handed her the citation and climbed back into the tow truck. Her screams echoed into the night as the taillights faded into the darkness. Back in the present, as Karen's voice cracked from yelling at the police who refused to take action, Jake tipped his hat. The sheriff on duty had already been briefed. Everything was above board. Karen, red in the face, stomped her feet and shouted that she would press charges. Jake just smiled and said softly, "Don't worry, ma'am, we'll send the storage invoice to your HOA address." That's when Karen realized she hadn't just picked a fight with a rancher. She had picked a fight with a businessman, a strategist, and worst of all, someone who doesn't forget. The war had only begun. And Jake? He wasn't going to let up until every injustice she ever caused came back to bite her. Karen may have thought the tow truck incident was over, but Jake hadn't even put his boots all the way on yet. After Karen's SUV was hauled off and she embarrassed herself in front of half the neighborhood screaming at a sheriff's deputy who wasn't taking her side, Jake quietly slipped back into the rhythm of ranch life, or so it seemed. What Karen couldn't see was that Jake had begun pulling strings behind the scenes, turning this neighborhood spat into a full-blown operation. His ranch truck had been returned from the yard, now sitting proudly back at its usual post by the front gate. But Jake wasn't interested in just getting even. He was interested in exposing every crooked move Karen had made, and by the time she figured that out, it would be too late to undo the damage. Jake started with records. The newly acquired tow company had everything: paperwork, call logs, scanned faxes, and digital dispatch notes that showed exactly who had called and what, when, and where it went. Jake asked the company's office manager, who had stayed on after the sale, to print a full year's worth of HOA-related service requests. She was more than happy to help. In fact, she seemed downright relieved. She told Jake, between hushed tones and nervous glances, that things hadn't felt right for a long time. There were tows ordered with no plate numbers, some without photos, and most disturbingly, many without signatures from the actual property owners. But Karen's name? It showed up again and again. Sometimes with aliases, sometimes just scribbled over as authorized HOA action. But the pattern was clear. She'd weaponized the towing company against anyone she didn't like. Jake knew he needed to dig deeper, so he dropped by the local courthouse and pulled property lines, HOA jurisdiction maps, and municipal towing laws. He even drove to the zoning office, bringing donuts and a smile to the front desk clerk who dug out records that hadn't seen daylight in years. Sure enough, Jake's land fell just outside the HOA's reach. Legally, the HOA had no authority to take action against any vehicle on or adjacent to his property. In other words, the tow on his truck wasn't just shady, it was fully illegal. Now he had a paper trail to prove it. He wasn't the only one who had been hit, either. Over the next 2 days, Jake made quiet house calls to several residents around the HOA perimeter. One was an older veteran named Tom, who'd had his pickup towed during Christmas week for excessive rust. Another was a single mom, Angie, whose visiting brother's car disappeared while parked in her driveway. She said Karen refused to answer her door when confronted and sent a nasty letter threatening additional fines for disturbance. Everyone Jake spoke to remembered the same thing: Karen acting like she was queen of the neighborhood, making threats and enforcing rules that didn't even exist in the bylaws. Most people had just swallowed the fines, afraid to fight back or unsure how to even start. But Jake wasn't afraid, and now he had a way to fight back that didn't require a courtroom. He had the power of ownership, and that changed everything. He spent the rest of the week creating a file so thick it looked like a legal textbook. Every toe, every false claim, every overreach of HOA authority went in. He even found a series of text messages from Karen to Rusty, the previous owner of the tow company, demanding immediate tows and threatening to report him to code enforcement if he refused. Rusty had been too weary to push back, and Karen knew it. Jake couldn't blame him. It was easier to cave to someone like Karen than to fight when you had no backup. But now she wasn't dealing with someone who lacked options, she was dealing with someone who'd come prepared. Karen, meanwhile, strutted around like nothing had happened. She assumed Jake's revenge had ended with her car being towed, and returned a day later, freshly invoiced. She told her minions that it was a fluke, a mix-up, a freak accident in the system. She spun the tale so convincingly that by the next board meeting, she was back in her chair like nothing had changed. Jake wasn't invited to those meetings, but he didn't need to be. He had ears inside the board now. A quiet revolt had been growing ever since her power trip began. 2 board members had already resigned, and the treasurer, a meek man named Dennis, had started sending Jake copies of HOA expenditure reports under the table. Jake knew from the first glance that something was off. The HOA was collecting thousands in towing fines every quarter, but only a portion of that showed up on the books. Dennis admitted he didn't even know where some of the money was going. He said Karen had insisted on handling the external vendor payments herself. She claimed it was to streamline the process. But Jake saw what was really going on. She was likely pocketing a cut, maybe laundering it through a relative's business or using fake shell accounts. It was sloppy but dangerous, and now that Jake owned the tow company, he could audit every dollar that had ever gone from HOA funds into Rusty's operation. It was all there. Undeniable. One evening, Jake got a call from one of Karen's favorite enforcers, a woman named Sheila who loved rules more than common sense. She'd come to complain about suspicious movement on Jake's property. She said it looked like construction. Jake said it was just fence repairs, and he didn't need HOA permission since he wasn't in the HOA. But the call gave him an idea. If Karen was snooping around again, he'd give her something to snoop about. That night, he posted a fake notice at the front of his gate. It read "Permit Pending, Private Livestock Testing Facility." No one knew what it meant, but by morning, the rumor had spread that Jake was building something scientific. The HOA board panicked. Karen tried to bluff her way into getting details but was shut down. When she drove by to take photos, Jake stood out front holding a clipboard and waved, just like she used to. But the biggest move came on Friday. Jake scheduled an official HOA meeting review with a representative from the county council, citing misuse of authority, misuse of funds, and improper contracts. He attached everything: paperwork, photos, financial discrepancies, and affidavits from over a dozen homeowners. Karen didn't know yet, but within 48 hours, a full investigation would be launched. Her little empire, built on forged forms and scare tactics, was about to be audited by people she couldn't bully. Jake sat on his porch that night with his dog Duke at his feet, watching the sunset turn the clouds gold. He wasn't smiling out of spite. He was smiling because people like Karen always thought the world would roll over for them. But they never expected the quiet guy with a ranch and a rolled-up flannel sleeve to be the one holding the receipt. He sipped his tea and whispered to himself, "Round 2's coming. Let's see if she brings her clipboard or a lawyer." The dusty morning sunlight hadn't even finished crawling across Jake's front yard when his phone buzzed with a call from Rusty, the former owner of the tow company. Jake picked up with a low, steady "yeah." Rusty's voice crackled with the usual rasp, but this time there was an edge to it. "Karen just called again, man. She's trying to get another car hauled. Says she's got 'em lined up like dominoes, and she wants 3 moved by noon. Didn't even ask if the paperwork was in order." Jake stood up from the porch swing, stretched his back, and looked out across his property as Duke barked at a squirrel. Jake told Rusty to send over the request logs immediately and thanked him. The plan was working. Karen thought the tow company still belonged to Rusty. She didn't realize Jake now held every lever she used to pull. He looked through the logs later that morning and felt his blood run cold, not from anger, but from how calculated she'd become. The people she was targeting now weren't random. They were the same neighbors who'd spoken to Jake in private, the ones brave enough to come forward about her abuses. Angie's brother's car, Tom's replacement truck, even one elderly couple who lived near the edge of the development and had dared to ask questions at the last board meeting. Karen was going after all of them, fast and merciless. Jake couldn't let that stand. If he sat back now, she'd keep pressing, maybe even start towing in retaliation to what she suspected but couldn't yet prove. So Jake decided it was time to go from defense to offense. First, he went back to Rusty and made him an offer on something that hadn't been included in the initial sale: the fleet itself. The trucks were old, a few barely roadworthy, but Jake didn't want them for what they could tow. He wanted the image. Within a week, he had the trucks rebranded under a new division called County Line Vehicle Compliance. It sounded official, maybe even government-backed. That was intentional. He kept the trucks parked visibly outside his ranch, two lined up at the gate with magnetic logos and reflective stickers. Karen drove by twice that day. The second time, she slammed her brakes so hard it kicked up gravel. But Jake wasn't finished. He called in a few favors from old friends in county code enforcement. Not the ones Karen liked to schmooze with, but the ones who owed Jake for helping out with storm recovery last year. They agreed to take a discreet look into some of the HOA's permits and licenses. Within 72 hours, the inspection notices started arriving. First, a permit audit on the HOA clubhouse. Then, a compliance warning about the emergency access gate that Karen had padlocked herself. Finally, a noise violation citation for one of her private parties held in a public green space. Jake hadn't filed those complaints, but he'd provided enough breadcrumbs for the truth to land squarely in Karen's lap. Karen responded like only she could, by throwing a tantrum at the next HOA board meeting so dramatic it was overheard 3 houses down. She accused unnamed individuals of sabotaging her leadership. She called the citations fake, accused Jake of weaponizing county bureaucracy, and tried to push through a new motion to ban all heavy-duty vehicles from HOA boundaries without board pre-approval. That would have effectively banned Jake's ranch truck again, even though it only entered public roads. But this time, the board didn't back her. One by one, they pushed back. Dennis, the treasurer, finally grew a spine and asked where the fine money from last quarter had gone. Karen had no answer. Her eyes darted between the members, and her voice cracked for the first time since Jake had ever heard her speak. She called for an early adjournment and stormed out. Jake didn't celebrate that night. He had other plans. He made a formal request through the towing company's new legal team for an internal audit of all tows authorized by the HOA over the past year. Because the tow company had been operating under contract with the HOA, those records were now his. What he found shocked even him. Over 60 vehicles had been towed under Karen's direct orders, without proper notice, documentation, or owner approval. At least 10 of them were from addresses outside the legal HOA boundary. Most of them came with added storage fees that had gone missing in Rusty's books. Karen hadn't just been overstepping, she had possibly been embezzling. To build the case further, Jake reached out to those affected. He brought them into his barn one evening, a dozen folding chairs set in a circle. He laid out what he'd found. Some of them were stunned. Others were angry. One man broke down, explaining how his wife had cried when their car disappeared before her chemotherapy appointment. They'd never known who to blame. Now they did. Jake wasn't a natural speaker, but he didn't need to be. His words were clear. If they stuck together, they could bring Karen down, not with rage, but with facts. Together, they formed a coalition. Dennis agreed to share internal board communications. Angie's brother was a paralegal who helped file formal complaints. Jake used his own lawyer to draft a cease and desist letter citing vehicle misappropriation, sent directly to Karen's mailbox with a confirmation signature required. Karen opened it on camera. Security footage from her own Ring doorbell showed her expression going from smug to pale. The video ended up anonymously posted to the neighborhood's private forum. Within hours, it had over 80 views and a comment thread longer than a CVS receipt. Karen tried one last stunt. She filed a restraining order against Jake, claiming harassment and stalking. But when the case hit the local court, the judge took one look at the evidence Jake's lawyer provided and dismissed it on the spot. Not only that, but the judge issued a warning to Karen about abusing legal systems for personal vendettas. Her face burned red in the courtroom, and by the time she left, half the attendees had turned their backs on her. Jake made one final move that week. He organized a formal open forum meeting at the local community center. It was packed. Karen arrived 30 minutes late, hoping to speak last and reclaim control of the narrative. But when she walked in, Jake was already at the podium, calmly explaining the full audit findings, complete with printed packets distributed to every attendee. He detailed the illegal tows, the financial inconsistencies, the code violations, and the public manipulation. And when he was done, he didn't ask for applause. He simply stepped down and let the room speak for itself. The crowd erupted. People stood up, telling their own stories. Shouts rang out demanding Karen's resignation. She tried to defend herself, but the mic was cut off when she violated forum rules. She left to the sound of booing, the first time anyone had ever pushed back and won. Jake walked out the side door, the cool night air hitting his face like a reward. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The tide had turned. The truth was out. And Karen's fortress of fake authority was collapsing one broken policy at a time. Jake knew she wasn't finished yet. But neither was he. And next time? He wouldn't just expose her. He'd make sure she paid for every inch of control she ever stole. Karen's downfall wasn't quiet. It wasn't graceful. And it certainly wasn't quick. No, she went down like a storm tearing through a trailer park, loud, chaotic, and determined to take everything with her. After the community center meeting, she didn't disappear or resign. She doubled down. The woman didn't know how to lose. She convinced herself that everyone who spoke out was part of some elaborate conspiracy Jake had orchestrated to take her down. In her twisted logic, she was the victim of a smear campaign, not the perpetrator of a long trail of violations and power abuses. And so, in true Karen fashion, she went nuclear. The first sign of her retaliation came 3 days later when a fleet of orange cones and makeshift signs appeared at the entrance to Jake's Ranch Road. They were printed with official-looking HOA warnings that claimed road access was temporarily suspended due to unauthorized land usage pending board investigation. Jake knew they were fake. The HOA had no power to restrict his private road, and he had the land deed framed on his office wall. But still, the cones blocked the gravel entrance and confused his delivery driver, who turned back thinking he'd hit a construction zone. When Jake walked out with his boots still muddy from feeding cattle and tore the signs down, 2 of Karen's lackeys appeared from behind a bush with a phone recording him, narrating that he was destroying HOA property. Later that afternoon, a county inspector arrived unannounced. He looked uncomfortable and explained that he'd received a formal complaint about unlicensed livestock activity, possibly involving biohazard waste from an unregulated testing facility. Jake stared at him in disbelief before realizing this was about the fake sign he'd posted as a joke. Permit pending, private livestock testing facility, a prank meant to mess with Karen's obsession with control. He never imagined she'd weaponize the county over it. Jake walked the inspector through every inch of his barn, fields, and livestock enclosures. The man took notes, snapped pictures, and finally said, clearly embarrassed, that everything was in perfect order and that he'd be closing the file. Before leaving, he muttered, "She's called us before. You're not the first ranch she's tried this on." That same week, Jake received a thick envelope in the mail, an official-looking package from the HOA's legal representative. It accused him of defamation, cyber harassment, and unauthorized use of company logos in the rebranded tow trucks he now owned. According to the letter, Karen was claiming Jake's new tow operation intentionally misled residents into thinking it was a county-authorized agency. Jake handed the papers to his lawyer, who laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. He drafted a response so blistering that even Jake raised an eyebrow reading it. Not only was the tow company private and operating within full legal limits, but the only one misusing authority was Karen. And the HOA? Well, the board hadn't even authorized the letter Karen sent. She'd taken it upon herself to use the association's resources, again, without approval. Jake knew this wasn't just about her SUV anymore. This was Karen trying to salvage her power by burying him under paperwork, distractions, and community drama. But what she didn't understand was that Jake was prepared for the long haul. Ranchers don't panic when the weather changes. They adapt. Jake met with Dennis again, who whispered that Karen had started pressuring the board into silence. She claimed that anyone who released confidential HOA documents to outside parties could be sued for breach of contract. Dennis laughed it off, saying there was no such clause in their agreements, but the threat alone had scared off 2 more board members from cooperating further. Meanwhile, Jake kept pushing forward. He had the HOA's financial reports from Dennis, which now showed a disturbing trend. There were payments made out to consulting firms that didn't exist, check numbers missing in the registry, and a recurring invoice marked facility services, tied to a P.O. box in another state. Jake suspected she'd set up a dummy company to funnel HOA funds. But suspicion wasn't enough. He needed evidence. So he hired a forensic accountant. The man wasn't cheap, but within 2 weeks, he traced the shell company back to an LLC registered under the name of Karen's cousin, someone who, according to public records, hadn't filed taxes in 3 years. Jake's lawyer smiled like he'd just found a gold nugget the size of a fist. At the same time, community pressure on Karen was mounting. Anonymous flyers started circulating showing a timeline of her misconduct. Photos of her SUV being towed were attached to screenshots of her screaming at deputies. Jake didn't print them, but he didn't stop them either. He didn't need to fight dirty, he just needed to keep telling the truth. And now, the neighborhood finally had the courage to listen. More people came forward. One man shared that Karen had threatened to ban his grandchildren from visiting if they didn't meet HOA behavior expectations. A woman said Karen threatened to report her husband for illegal home repairs when all he was doing was fixing a gutter. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern of power-mad intimidation. Karen, increasingly cornered, did what power-hungry people always do: she lashed out one more time. She called another emergency HOA meeting, this time closed to the public. No one was allowed in except board members. Jake wasn't supposed to know what happened inside, but Dennis called him later that night and recounted every word. Karen screamed about traitors, accused Jake of colluding with county officials, and tried to pass a motion to remove all HOA financial documents from public access. It failed by 1 vote. She was outnumbered, and she knew it. She left the meeting in silence, her face blank, her control slipping faster than she could regain it. The final straw came the next morning when Karen woke up to find her prized Mercedes SUV gone again, only this time it wasn't towed. It had been repossessed. Turns out she'd stopped making payments while fighting all these legal fires and using HOA funds to cover personal expenses. The finance company had flagged it and sent a team out overnight. When she tried to call 911, again screaming that her car had been stolen by that rancher, the dispatcher calmly told her there was nothing they could do. The repossession had been legal, the claim validated, and she'd already received 3 past due notices. She hung up without another word. For the first time, Karen didn't yell, didn't stomp, didn't even go outside to throw a fit. She stayed indoors, her kingdom crumbling around her. Jake didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The town, the board, the HOA members, everyone knew now. Karen wasn't a leader. She was a tyrant with a clipboard. And with every desperate move she made, she exposed herself more. Jake walked past her house that evening with Duke on a leash and tipped his hat as she peeked out from behind her curtains. Her gaze dropped instantly. No words were spoken. But the silence said everything. Jake had weathered the storm. Karen, on the other hand, was still trying to stand in the rain, soaked in her own arrogance, pretending she had never lost control. But everyone knew better. The rancher had done more than defend his truck. He'd defended his land, his name, and his neighbors. And the story wasn't over just yet. The courthouse was packed tighter than a rodeo on a Saturday night. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of angry residents and curious neighbors, and the low hum of murmured conversations filled the chambers like a swarm of bees. Jake sat near the front in a clean button-down and faded jeans, his boots dusted but polished, his face calm. Karen, in contrast, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair frizzed around the edges, and she clutched a folder so tightly it seemed she was trying to choke the life out of it. This wasn't just a court hearing anymore. This was Judgment Day, and Karen knew it. What started as a minor civil suit had grown into a wildfire. Jake's legal team had filed the original case for damages due to an unlawful vehicle tow. But once the court saw the breadth of documents, statements, and financial inconsistencies Jake's team presented, the county expanded the investigation. The judge approved a broader scope, which brought the HOA's conduct, financial management, and Karen's personal actions under scrutiny. Karen's strategy had always been intimidation and confusion. Throw enough threats, fine enough people, and scare the rest into silence. But in court, none of that worked. Facts did. And Jake had plenty. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings started with a review of HOA documents, most of them brought to light thanks to Dennis, who was now a witness. He testified that Karen had been moving money from one budget category to another without approval and had made payments to vendors that no one had ever met. The judge raised an eyebrow when Dennis explained that Karen had insisted on handling those payments herself, to save the board time. Jake's lawyer followed up by presenting the findings from the forensic accountant, clearly linking HOA funds to a shell company operated by Karen's cousin. The judge asked Karen to explain. She stood, wobbled slightly, and launched into a rehearsed speech about serving the community with integrity and trusting her team with outsourced management. But it was empty. Her voice cracked. Her arguments fell flat. The judge asked again, plainly, "Did you approve these payments personally?" Karen paused, swallowed, and muttered, "Yes, but," and that was all the court needed to hear. The next part focused on the illegal towing activity. Jake's lawyer presented over a dozen statements from residents whose vehicles had been removed without notice or authorization. The room gasped when photos were shown of an elderly woman's car being towed while she was inside it, still buckled in, because Karen claimed she looked suspicious. One by one, the community members spoke, their stories overlapping with eerie similarity. Karen had called them violations, they were never warned, and the fines followed like clockwork. Jake sat quietly while each of them told their part, not once speaking out or interrupting. He didn't need to. The people were doing it for him now. Then came the final blow. The tow company's logbooks, now fully digitized under Jake's ownership, revealed that Karen had placed over 60 towing orders in the past year. Almost all of them without proper documentation, many of them involving properties outside the HOA's legal boundary. The judge called it what it was: abuse of authority and a breach of contract. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she had been acting in the best interest of the community, but even the HOA's own bylaws contradicted that claim. With every new revelation, Karen slumped further into her chair until she barely looked recognizable, just another person who had let power get to her head. When the judge announced the verdict, the room went completely still. Karen was found liable for misappropriation of funds, violation of civil property rights, and negligence in her duties as an HOA officer. She was ordered to personally repay a portion of the embezzled funds, and the HOA itself was instructed to cover damages to all affected residents, including Jake. Jake's awarded compensation wasn't just monetary. It came with a formal public apology from the HOA, a directive to reform internal policies, and a ruling that no vehicle could be towed without a court-reviewed notice going forward. Karen stood there, frozen, as the judge instructed her to step down from her position, effective immediately. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers. It didn't need to. The silence said more. Karen left the courthouse under the weight of her own collapse, her SUV long gone, her control shattered. Jake didn't gloat. As he walked outside into the warm sun, he was greeted by handshakes, pats on the back, and a few hugs from neighbors who once feared speaking up. Dennis came over, tears in his eyes, and thanked Jake for giving them the strength to stop being afraid. Angie's brother laughed as he joked about finally parking his car without checking the sky for drones. The elderly couple Karen had once fined for unauthorized wind chimes brought Jake a homemade pie. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, putting things right and making sure someone like Karen could never abuse power again. 2 weeks later, Jake received a call from the new acting HOA president, a woman named Marie who had been on the board but rarely spoke up until now. She said they had held a special vote and wanted to appoint him as the official property rights liaison, a new position created to ensure that what happened before would never happen again. Jake hesitated, then agreed, but only on one condition: everything had to be transparent. Every board meeting recorded, every policy published, and every complaint processed by at least 3 people. Marie smiled and said that was already in the works. The HOA had learned. The whole neighborhood had. That weekend, Jake hosted a barbecue on his ranch. People came in droves. Families, seniors, teenagers, even former board members. They brought lawn chairs, lemonade, potato salad, and relief. Someone brought a portable speaker and started playing old country tunes. Kids ran through sprinklers while adults traded stories about the good old days before Karen. At sunset, Jake stood on a small platform, raised a glass of sweet tea, and thanked everyone for standing up, not for him, but for themselves. He didn't mention Karen's name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what this celebration was really about. Just before the night ended, one of the neighbors rolled out a surprise: a handcrafted wooden sign, stained and sanded, with thick metal lettering. It read, "Towed by the rancher, we haul more than just metal." The whole crowd laughed, clapped, and begged him to hang it at the front gate. Jake didn't say yes or no. He just leaned it against the barn and smiled as Duke barked twice and wagged his tail like he understood the whole thing. Karen, meanwhile, had moved out quietly. Her house was up for sale, stripped of its overgrown garden statues and aggressive, no parking signs. No one knew where she went, and no one seemed to care. Her reign was over, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when you pick the wrong person to mess with, especially someone who owns the very company you use to tow their truck. Jake never wanted power. He just wanted peace. And now, with his truck back where it belonged, his land protected, and his neighbors standing tall, he finally had it. The ranch was quiet again, the way it used to be, the way it should have always stayed. And if anyone ever tried to pull something like that again, well, they'd find out real quick what happens when you tug the wrong chain in a town where the rancher owns the hook.